Okay, today I am speaking to somebody new, but somebody whose work I've been following for a while. His name is Marco Petracca. I'm butchering the name, I'm sure, but we'll have him help me out with that. The entity that I know him best for is something called HHNOI, which is HHNOI. They released on the Modularfield label, which we interviewed Markus from them a couple of weeks ago. I've been kind of following Hanoi for a while, and I was very excited to get a chance to speak to Marco. So with that, I'm going to shut up, and we're going to talk to Marco. Hey, Marco,
Yeah.
how's it going?
Hi, Darwin. Fine, thank you. All fine here.
So why don't we start off by having you pronounce your name correctly?
Which one, the artist name or
your
the surname?
your name.
Yeah, okay, my name is Marco Petracca, and the artist name is HHNOI, spelled HHNOI.
All right, cool. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Hanoi, what your work is in that environment? Because you actually work under a number of different names or have over the past, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, Hanoi was actually some sort of detour or some sort of subsidiary of what I did before with Here, together with a singer from Düsseldorf, Kristin, which was and still is my bandmate back then, but we are sort of in a hiatus for the last 4 or 5 years, I think. And I always had a folder with all the things that I couldn't use for that project, which was HHNOI. The NOI being an abbreviation for noise, because it was sometimes too noisy for her or sometimes too noisy for the project. At some point, I started to post these bits of noise or whatever I made on the Modular on Instagram under that moniker, HHNOI.
Right.
Back then, I was asked by a label from London, I think Ninth World Records or something like that, if I would be interested to release an album with them, although I never was thinking about doing something under that name in terms of releasing or something. It was really just more like a musical diary of things I did at night on the Modular. And then it started rolling. And since then, HHNOI is actually my main project. Next, of course, to some other things I do in between, like remixes or Here is not dead yet. There could be actually a revival in the next couple of years, who knows? But HHNOI is the main focus at the moment.
Very interesting. I'll tell you, first of all, it's interesting because the name HHNOI, I mean, I saw it and I immediately pronounced it Hanoi, so it wasn't that far, It wasn't hard for me to remember. But it's actually one of those names that's really great because if you remember the letters, it's really easy to find in search. There's so many.
Right, that's true.
There's so many things that if you Google them, you get like 900 versions of whatever you searched for. This is very particular. It's you and all about you for sure.
Yeah, it has that sort of. At the beginning, I was not quite happy that the name suddenly got a little bit more popular, at least in the scene. But somehow, I realized that people start thinking on how to pronounce it, and so they keep it in their memory,
right?
Which is a nice side effect, actually.
Yeah, it is. This is this project like mostly or completely modular based? And is that how you kind of frame what HHNOI is versus your other work?
Well, let's say the core of it is always modular, but not necessarily in terms of technology, more in terms of how I compose these tracks, which is more like either having some sort of more philosophical concept, not necessarily a musical concept behind that, but always starting with a blank page and sort of noisy sound experiments, which I try to shape into something that is more harmonic and more pleasing to at least my ear. So that's the framework. On most of the releases or some of the releases, there's lots of work actually on the computer, but everything is recorded on the Modular. But as opposed to playing live, for example, where you just on a Modular where you just blast out every layer and everything through your stereo sum, I tend to record bit after bit and see what fits together. And then, of course, there's editing and these kind of things.
Right. One of the things that's difficult on modular is to do more long form composition. And one of the things I like about your work is that there tends to be like multiple layers of sequencing. So I oftentimes will hear short, discrete sequences layered over sort of like longer form sequences. and that layered over very long form sequences, right? It seems like you work in these multiple layers simultaneously, and that sometimes can be hard to do if you're sequencing on the modular alone.
Yeah, right. That's the whole point. I mean, back then when I started it, sequencers on the modular, especially on Eurorack, were not that refined. You maximum had like 16 steps and maybe like 2 or 3 channels you could work with. Nowadays, you have modules that have like up to 8 channels, and you can go into polyrhythms and break up the numbers and stuff like that. But nevertheless, there's this kind of repeating and repetition and redundancy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you start to fiddle around, like going, okay, let's make this one sequence longer and this one sequence shorter and let it play against each other and try to build up with that instead of going the techno way or whatever. Because then I find, I mean, that's the main thing that disturbs me about modular is that it's this element of repetition, and I think that's something that is really like the challenge to keep it interesting. Although you have to work with repeating everything.
Well, it's interesting you say that you don't want it to go the techno way, because a lot of times the concepts really do go back to those like late 90s or even mid 90s techno kind of memes, right? Which is where you set patterns going and you're adjusting the filter, or you're tweaking the tuning a little bit. And there's a lot of repetition with sort of like minimalist sonic treatment. Now, I would say that you are one of the people whose work I like that I would also say tends to focus a lot on sound design.
Yeah, absolutely does. That's the thing that fascinates me most about modular, actually, because you link to the structure of a modular synth where you can actually patch everything the way you think it sounds best for your ears. Of course, you end up having something that is monotonous and trying to transform it into something that sounds interesting. So you are in the process of composition already sound designing, or some people do, like Nathan Moody, for example, who's a great artist. That's what I like more. Or Alessandro Cortini, speaking of which, who's actually also more like going the repetitive way, but he builds up sounds, and that's absolutely fascinating. That hooked me, or that got me actually into modular, the whole sound designing aspect.
Interesting. Well, it's interesting also that you mentioned Nathan Moody, because you are. Has the release come out, or is it about to come out?
No, it's next month, 14th of June.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You've got a release with Nathan Moody called Future Rituals.
Right. Yeah, that's coming up.
Yeah, now I got a chance to hear an early release of that. I think in this case, you both kind of attacked his sample library, right?
Right.
You used that as kind of a launching point?
Yeah, that was sort of the DNA. The idea actually came through a concert we played together over here in Cologne a couple of months ago, where it was a back-to-back concert where we actually both had our setups built up, and we were trying to make music based on his last album release, which had a quite interesting backdrop, because he wanted to make some sort of soundtrack to a dystopian society. So he was actually going so far that he
like handmade all the instrument, right?
Right, exactly. He tried to imagine what, like, for example, music to a funeral or to a wedding after an atomic disaster would sound like, and what kind of instruments these people would use. So he built the instruments by itself, and that was so fascinating that we decided, okay, how can we transform that story into a live context? So what he did was he gave me the sampling library where all the loops and kind of sounds from these instrument build-up, they were on an SD card, and then I tried to integrate that into my modular setup or into the live setup, and we composed music around these samples. And that was so much fun, that gig, and it actually had super good feedback, because it was an interesting thing that we decided to make that split release together. However, I think my approach towards his sampling or his samples was different than his approach, because he actually used his sounds while I went really granular and distorted everything and went into tiny bits and made new sounds out of that, which was super fun to do, actually. But I admire Nathan for what he does, because I think, especially in terms of sound design, he's a genius.
Yeah, I agree. But I would give you some of that too. I mean, one of the things that really caught me early in my research on you was the way that you describe yourself as a person who doesn't particularly like ambient music, but who
Right.
finds himself in a position of doing ambient music, right?
Yeah, that's the point. Yeah.
And I think that that's a really curious twist, but it kind of shows in your work, because you oftentimes seem to be like fighting with the what would easily be like, here's a beautiful pad, I'm just going to wallow in this pad for a while, right? You always seem to be like fighting the urge to do the easy thing, which is something that I really like in your music.
Thank you. That's a nice compliment. That's really a nice compliment. I mean, it's always interesting to hear the outside perspective, because, I mean, as modular people are mostly part-time artists, because we are always spending time in front of the machine instead of talking with people about the music we make with that.
Right.
Yeah, it's definitely that. Like I said before, with the sequencers and the whole repetition thing, you end up either in that you do something like Richard Devine, which is total chaos, however he does it, which is absolutely awesome, or you end up in that techno repetitive thing, or you end up in ambient. That's like the three paths of modular you can actually go, and there's gray zones in between. I don't like neither of those. I'm not a big fan of techno music. I had that 20 years ago. It's stalling from my perspective. Ambient, I somehow, most of the things I find quite boring, although I admire some of the people and I really respect the creativity behind that, but it's nothing I could listen to for longer than 5 minutes.
Right.
And I try to be somewhere in between there, always finding my own niche between ambient and everything that's a little bit more like abstract beat orientated or something like that. But to my perception, I never succeed, and that's what HHNOI is all about. Not succeeding.
Well, that's funny, because it sounds like actually the whole project sort of started out by having kind of or producing work that was like frustratingly not useful at the time, right?
Right.
That's
right. That's the whole beginning. Yeah.
So one of the things I like to do is I like to talk to people about their background, and in your case, you do this beautiful music, has HHNOI, but you've done more pop oriented stuff in the past. You have, in my research, I find out that you are truly a very multi instrumentalist, and you have been very busy over your career. I'm curious though about what your background is, how you got to be the artist you are. I mean, did you grow up in a real musical environment? Did you study music, or were you like influenced by the party scene? I'm always curious about where people came from.
I didn't study music, not in a professional way. I remember that I was forced by my parents to take piano lessons. We were not really like a creative household or anything. So my parents were like simple Italian immigrants and workers and stuff like that. But they always wanted me to be like the one who will go to university and who will be a little bit more intellectual. So they forced me into piano lessons, but I didn't like that. I was like, no, that's nothing for me. But at some point in my teenage years, I think I stumbled upon the Depeche Mode 101 live concert video, the VHS back then. And there was this one scene where Alan Wilder explained his MU sampler. And I suddenly fell in love with the idea that you actually could have something that has like a piano, that has like the piano keys or a keyboard, but you could actually create any sound you want. And that was the initial spark. So, the first money I earned with side jobs I spent in a synthesizer, and from there everything went on. I mean, in between I taught myself guitar, then bass guitar, then I had some drum lessons back then, and it mixed up quite a bit. But the original passion was always into electronic music, and more like the not so mainstream electronic music. Yeah, and from that went off to keep a long story short. I did soundtracks for telephone hotlines for back then in the 90s we had like these erotic hotlines where you could call late night, which were advertised on TV. So I earned my first money by making music for the advertisements and also for the hotline itself. You had to record that on tape back then because there were no CDs around there. Or CD burners were so expensive you couldn't do that. So I always had to record that on tape. But it was good money, even if the job was a little bit like, I don't know, smeary. Then I I played in some bands. I played in an electro-punk band with 2 other guys where we had a major contract, and we had tours playing in front of 1,500 people and stuff like that. But that also went down because we had problems in the studio back then. You couldn't link the computer to a tape machine and these kind of things. Yeah, and after that, I was so fed up with the music scene that I always tried to do my own things without trying to be commercially successful or anything. So that's where here started, that project with Christine, who's an absolute talented musician from Düsseldorf. And from there, everything happened. So remixes, collaborations. But the main passion was always creating sounds on my own and then see where it goes.
Yeah. It's really interesting. What was that first synth that you bought with your working money?
That was a Korg 01W. So this kind of workstation that could do everything.
Right.
That was, I think that was the time where analog was not on vogue anymore, and all the digital synths were more refined.
Yeah.
And of course, you wanted to have the most bang for the buck somehow. So I went with that one because it had an onboard sequencer and it had all these sounds and a drum kit and these kind of things. So it was not really a sequencer; it was more like a workstation.
Right.
Not a synthesizer, more like a workstation.
Yeah. I was going to say though that was a time when it felt so remarkable to be able to do a whole production right on the keyboard itself.
Right.
It led to a certain kind of writing, I think, that was sort of unique to that style of working. But also the sound, if you didn't want real sounding drums, you were often, kind of out of luck because some of the editing options were pretty limited.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, these were not really synthesizers because you had all the samples on a ROM inside. And you had your Yamaha drum kit in there and it always sounded the same. So you had to be creative if you wanted to let that sound different. But back then, I was not able to create sound design or anything because I didn't have the money to buy the tools for that. And of course, I didn't know what was actually possible. That was a few years later on when I bought my first sampler, and then I had my first analog synth and these kind of things where I suddenly realized, okay, there's something else than skipping through presets if you make music.
Right. Yeah. Well, it seems like what's interesting though is when you talk about the different groups you were involved in and different music making environments you were involved in, you actually kind of ran through the music world at a time when it seemed like everything was changing every 6 months, right?
Right.
So starting off with a workstation, but then samplers and sampling was really big, but you still working the tape. And then later on, ADATs were everywhere, and now it was all digital. And then the next thing you know, everyone's like, "Oh, we don't do that stuff. Everything works in the computer."
Right.
And that provided opportunities for synchronization that didn't exist before. You kind of got a chance to really surf through that whole thing.
It's interesting, actually, because yesterday I saw on YouTube that interview between Daniel Miller and Martin Gore from Moogfest, where they were talking about exactly that, these kind of phases when analog went into digital with synthesizers, and suddenly you had that whole thing, this whole idea that the plugins were as good or nearly as good as the hardware stuff, and everything was suddenly in a laptop, and you would make music completely different. As far as I remember, that at a certain point was something that threw me off from electronic music, because when you spend more time downloading and buying the latest plugins and skipping through presets instead of creating something, you suddenly end up in that loophole that you are more interested, like, okay, which kind of new technology could inspire me to make my next masterpiece instead of creating something.
That's actually really interesting. I never really thought of skipping through plugins on a preset being similar to skipping through presets on an 01W. But of course it is.
Okay.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and that was for me, I think, around 2010 or something, the reason to sell nearly every hardware synth I had back then, and also skip the computer and go into Modular. Because the idea to just have wires and knobs and nothing else in front of you, and not a preset and no possibility to save something, just this moment with the sound was so fascinating on one hand. On the other hand, of course, intimidating like hell. But that was like I would say, rejuvenation of the whole idea of being creative, at least for me. And I think if I talk to modular people, most of them from that era, like 2010, 2011, 2012, when the market was not as saturated as it is right now, had the same thing, that they suddenly realize, okay, you are able to make electronic music in a different kind of way instead of sitting in front of a computer. Not to say that is a bad thing, but the whole aspect of composition and playing with the music and not just building up something is quite interesting.
Well, there are some things about the modular that are almost the complete antithesis of the computer. And I think one of them is actually, I mean, I loved it when computers first came on the scene, because I grew up in the physical tape world and then going into ADATs and stuff. I went through that as well. And the one thing I loved about the computer-based recording systems was when the next day when I wanted to work on something, I turned on the power and everything came up exactly the way it was yesterday, right?
Well, if you were lucky.
Right.
Depending on your computer.
Right, but generally speaking, you could at least get close to that, right?
Yeah, that's true.
On the modular, it's almost the exact opposite. Especially if you tear apart the cables or whatever, you are never going to get back the thing that you want. But in a way, that's also now become the reason that I'm entranced by it, is because it's very much of the moment, right?
Yeah,
if I
absolutely.
like something, I like it right then, and I can't expect that next week it's going to be the same thing.
Right. That's really an intriguing thing about composing on a modular, that you have to appreciate the moment. It's not like this kind of production process like you would have on a computer, where, like you say, you save and the next evening you continue, which always leads to, I don't know how you handle it. For me, it leads to having like gigabytes of folders with these kind of basic ideas that are like 32 bars or a melody, which you never continue.
Yeah.
And that's something you wouldn't do on a modular, because you end up with something that's worth recording, or you just see it as a jam session.
Right, exactly.
You just walk away, see it as a jam session, drink your glass of wine, and go to bed.
Right. That's exactly right. Well, it's funny though, because often too, one of the things I noticed on your site, you actually have a video for the "They Ate the Clouds" track.
Yeah,
where it kind of shows you working with your modular. And one of the things that caught my eye is that you actually do something that I tend to do a lot, but you also take it further. I like setting up a patch and then doing a lot of playing with the knobs. I'm constantly touching the machine, right? There's something about it and in fact, when I choose modules, I often choose ones that draw me towards touching them. Now, I noticed that in addition to you like hitting the knobs and controlling a lot of stuff, you also use touch plates a lot as a way to interact with and sort of like and literally play the machine, right?
Yeah. At least at home in my studio, I do that a lot, because I just to give it a little bit more of a human feel, and of course to interact with the machine. Not only in terms of sound design, but also in terms of what's playing when and these kind of things. Live, I realized, especially let's say when I started playing live on a modular in front of an audience, I realized that I'm sometimes too panicky when it comes to pay attention to what I'm doing next. And it also, I like this kind of planned improvisation. So I'm refusing to use touch plates or anything that could be like really playable in a live context, because I want to create more these cascades of sound. So live, I'm playing more the sequences, actually, switching sequences in between. That's a different kind of beast, actually, live. But in the studio context, never without touch plates. Definitely.
Right. Oh, that's really interesting, because I was going to ask if that is kind of at the heart of your live performance. It sounds like not. So then how do you translate some of your studio stuff, at least conceptually? I mean, one of the things about a lot of people who do modular work is that their live performances are not necessarily replications of their album releases, right? Mm-hmm. The only person I've talked to that actually really focuses on doing that is Alessandro Cortini, who really wants to do his albums when he goes out on stage, most people, try and bring the modular on stage and try and do something. How do you take the ideas that you come up with in the studio and translate them to live if you're actually changing your technique?
Yeah, it was a difficult process to achieve that. I mean, live, it's still, like I said, a different kind of beast. I'm trying to mix a little bit of improvisation, keeping myself the freedom of going 10 minutes on a 4-minute track if the atmosphere is right for that. Nevertheless, I'm always able to recreate what I did on recordings beforehand, but I'm cheating on that just out of that reason that I really tend to get panicky when something doesn't work. So I have this 1010 Music Bitbox. As a touch, which is this kind of MPC touch plate sampler, or a touch display sampler in module format, where I have some stems, which are like not necessarily the melodic foundation, but at least the sound aesthetic of the album recordings. And everything that is melody comes out of a sequencer, which I obviously pre-program, but I leave myself the freedom to skip through the sequences the way I want in that moment. So it's not necessarily running through a song. It's more that I sort of steer the song in the direction I want to go with live. That's how but it took a long while to get there.
That's really interesting. Well, it's interesting that you use the Bitbox for that. I've become a huge fan of that sampler. To me, it's the right mix between just some samples and kind of a creative tool. I actually find it fits in a really nice spot for me. And in fact, I'm getting ready to do a performance, and I've got a whole portion of it that's related to firing off samples on the Bitbox as being kind of an important part of how I manage the difficulty or the complexity of a performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my opinion, it's also a lifesaver because I remember the very first live gig I had with the Modular. My rig was standing underneath some really old light bulbs or something. So during soundcheck, I tuned everything, and I had like 4 oscillators running for the melodies, and everything was in tune. And as soon as I started, everything was detuned. And of course, when you're running into a concert and you're trying to play melodic, stopping and tuning is not an option. And that's where I realized, okay, it's always good to have something in the backdrop in case something happens. So the Bitbox is perfect for that. Absolutely.
That's interesting. Now, one of the things I'm always curious about with modular people too is how much effects they use. And it seems to me like you play with distortion and overdrive a lot. And you also play with delays and reverbs a lot. How much of that is in the modular, and how much are using external processors for that?
Oh, there's only one external processor, which is also a CV controllable, which is the Retromechanical Labs Electron Fuzz, whatever. They have these really long, absurd names. That's the only outboard thing I use, and of course a compressor to glue everything together. And the rest is actually inside, like. Really? At the moment, in my current live setup, it's the Strymon Magneto for delays. Of course, clouds. Everyone has clouds. That's an option, and the Verb for these long reverbs, and some 2 or 3 smaller delays to create some glitches in between. And for distortion, which is sort of, I don't know if it's even appropriate to say that, because it's always like a little bit, if you say you have something from Döpfer in your rack, you sound cheap, but I really like that thing. That's this A136 distortion module or something. It's a really old thing, but it works wonders.
Well, that's really interesting, because I have been having a shit of a time trying to find an in-modular distortion I like. They tend to either be so oriented towards like bit reduction and crazy shit, or else it's like they're trying to do like tube saturation and like a little bit of warmth. And I want something like in between those two, and I have been struggling to find something that I like.
It's really difficult. I mean, there are so many beasts out there. Like one of my favorites is the 4MS Noise Swash. Still, although it's a pretty old module, but that's something you really never are able to handle, because that thing has a life on its own. And like you said, either it's bit crushing, like the WMD Geiger counter, for example, which I had a long time running, but it always sounds too digital. So for warm distortion, like I said, you should definitely check out Retro Mechanical Labs. Next to that, these kind of the things they create, even the stomp boxes, but also meanwhile they have a line of Eurorack modules. They always look like vintage. I don't know, Second World War gear you would steal out of a submarine or something. So they look awesome, but they have that really warm, distinctive sound. And I remember that even Alessandro Cortini and Suraj Chai and these people use these kind of things because they create this kind of this kind of more guitar-orientated distortion, but within the modular realm.
Yeah. Well, because one of the things I don't like is I don't like using. My friend Tom Hall uses guitar pedals a lot, but he uses a lot of these like modules that allow you to kind of jump out of the modular. It rechanges the levels for the pedal and then brings it back in, right? Yeah. But to me, it's like then all of a sudden it's like an octopus. There's stuff sticking everywhere,
right?
And I kind of like the idea of having the modular be an instrument inside of itself, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it depends. Like I said, I only have that one box outside, just because I don't have any more space for the live rig. At the moment, I'm curious in the noise engineering are bringing out these kind of 4 HP distortion modules where you have like 3 different kind of analog distortion circuitry, but I don't know the name of that yet, but it comes out within the next weeks or something. I think if someone is able in the modular world to handle a good kind of distortion in a small module, it's them, definitely. So that's something to look out, especially for live rigs.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now, talking about the musical side, you said that you weren't like formally trained in music, but you did have. I mean, it sounds like you had piano lessons that your parents pushed you into. You obviously worked with guitar for a while. You took drum lessons. How much has that kind of stuff influenced your current work? I mean, did you spend a lot of time learning things like harmony and chord changes and stuff like that? Or do you still really regard yourself as working almost solely by ear?
I think it's a mix in between. Somehow I realized by myself that knowing too much theory, although knowing theory is always good in my opinion, even if it's just something you taught yourself via YouTube videos or whatever. But it's not necessarily the best thing to overdo it with the theory, because then you end up always in the same patterns. And I'm more guided by listening to what feels right to me, which always tends to be something in D minor, funnily. I don't know why. I'm always going into D minor or A minor, these kind of keys and root notes. But yeah, it's a mix. I think it's a healthy dose of both, but not necessarily something where I would go like, okay, now this chord has to come, or this kind of rhythm is right, or something. It's more really gut feeling.
And how much do you collaborate with other people? Obviously, you have the collaboration with Here. How often, outside of Here, how often do you put yourself in a position to collaborate with other people?
I mean, it depends. There are people, or mostly, if I collaborate, then it's mostly people which I really admire. Like, for example, Nathan Moody, or I have one track going with a young artist from Great Britain who now resides in Los Angeles called Max Gray, who will hopefully also release at some point on Modularfield or finish his music. But it's because I listened to some of his demos and I was really in awe when I listened to what he did with sounds, and especially kind of this kind of dubstep bass design and these kind of things. But he also has a sound designing background. But it's always, I mean, if people ask me, I listen to their stuff. Of course, you get asked quite a lot. But I tend to choose to work with people which I really like and admire, or where I see something where their creative spark resonates within me. So it's not something that I'm trying to pursue, that I want to collaborate, but if it happens, it happens when I like it.
Sure. And when you do collaborate, do you ever do face-to-face collaborations, or is it always remote where you're sending files and tracks back and forth?
It's always remote, of course, because I live in Cologne in Germany, and the people I admire are mostly overseas or in different countries. Luckily, one of the collaborations I have is with my with my fiancée, Rachel Palmer. Although she is a musician and does ambient music, but she's a great visual artist and does these kind of generative things, crawling organisms on the wall and these kind of things. And as of lately, the past couple of gigs we were playing together, where she did the visuals to my music. So that's an obvious collaboration, but also because we live together. So instead of watching Netflix, we do this kind of thing.
Well, good for you. That's a good choice. That's a good choice. I had something I was going to ask, and I got to try and remember it here. So just give me 1 second.
No problem.
Yeah, I got it. All right. So now you say that you live in Cologne, and it's interesting to me because I didn't even know at this point that anybody lived in Germany that didn't live in Berlin. It seems like Berlin has become sort of the center of European, kind of a European music center. And so it was interesting for me to hear that you lived in Cologne. Is there a particular reason why you didn't rush to Berlin when everyone else did?
One obvious reason, of course, Berlin is kind of this Moloch, this huge beast, where you probably just end up when you want to be really creative. I was born in this region in North Rhine-Westphalia. I spent my whole youth here, and Cologne was an obvious choice because you have this kind of mix between a lively, creative, but not mainstream scene. You have, nevertheless, sort of the traditional North Rhine-Westphalian culture, which is more like, okay, let's drink a beer together no matter what you do for a living. So I like that. Berlin is just a little bit too big. Besides, at the moment, not only at the moment, in the past 10 years or something, Berlin got so overcrowded with creative people, which on one hand might be a good thing. On the other hand, you sort of drown in there. That's my opinion.
Well, it does seem when I talk to people, especially people who are relatively new to Berlin, they struggle finding an opportunity to do a gig because everything is completely packed full with people that everybody has heard of before, right? And so as a newcomer, it's very difficult to even break into the scene.
If you aim to commercial success, I think then Berlin is not necessarily the best choice, especially for electronic music. Unless you are a really hard worker or you have your connections and these kind of things. Although I think that applies to every big city.
Right. Yeah, I think you're probably right.
Yeah. The thing that sort of I don't like about Berlin is that it's always going into one direction. It's not that you have like let's say a more mixed, especially in terms of electronic music, a more mixed creative scene. You either have that noisy stuff or you have the techno
or the
stuff.
Minimalist, right? Yeah.
Yeah. But nothing in between. And the epicenter being Berghain, where you go like, okay, but why does it have to be this place? Why can't it be like a nice, healthy mix? And that's what I like, for example, about Cologne. Of course, we have a techno scene here with Compact Records being here as a worldwide brand. But on the other hand, you have small labels like Modularfield, which release modular music and ambient music played on guitars and experimental things. So that's quite nice to have, actually.
Indeed, yeah, it's very interesting. It resonates with me because, I've lived in the U.S. my whole life, but people always wondered why I didn't end up in either Los Angeles or New York or San Francisco. And it was like, well, because those scenes tend to drive you in one direction, and I wanted to go a different direction, So.
Yeah, absolutely. I was we were on Superbooth last weekend, which is like the yearly NobCon or whatever, or like one of the biggest synthesizer fairs in the world. And it's just fun to see all the people coming over there and catching that Berlin vibe, but always sticking into that, okay, let's make some techno and on our Rex. I go like, why don't you find that boring after a while?
Right.
Yeah, I find it boring after a while.
Yeah.
I respect the artists, don't get me wrong, but sometimes I go like, okay, not again, please.
Time for something else, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I can see where kind of diversity in flavors is something that you get elsewhere for sure. Yeah. So one of the things I also like asking people when I get a chance to is how they push themselves, how they find a way to inspire themselves into the next thing. And again, I'm a big fan of your music, and so I find that what I enjoy about listening to your work is that oftentimes I hear your voice, but it comes through different sounds, and it's a really interesting way to, when you grow to know an artist's work, it's really interesting to learn what part of the thing is their sound. What I'm curious is how you take the things that are in your head and the things that are in your heart, and what do you do to sort of like push yourself forward? Because it would be easy to say, well, I'm just going to do a long pad and run it through distortion pedal and then do a sequence over the top of that and run it through a reverb and call it a day, right?
Yeah, of course. No, as soon as it's just about gear or trying out new modules or new synths or something like that, in my opinion, for me, it ends up in something I never would listen to or would never stand behind. I see the whole music making process, probably also due to the age. I'm in my mid 40s now, a little bit more like not therapy, but more like, spilling out your mood on a blank canvas. And that's something, if you make the technological transposition into modular, that's exactly what I or some people do on the modular. They just follow the sound they hear and they try to express their feeling, at least in my opinion. So that's the creative process behind that. It's really mood dependent. It's really, weather dependent, and these kind of external factors play a huge role. If there's something that really bothers me, then I need that creative hour on the modular just to express what bothers me, without, even if I do it subconsciously, but it's really like venting for the soul, and that's what drives me. So that means as soon as it's summer and the weather is nice and everyone is happy around me, I can't make music. It doesn't work.
That's actually, I guess, if you focus on using D minor for most of your work, I guess that isn't a very summer key. So
right, it's totally not a summer key. Yeah, so I'm quite happy that actually we have a few concerts going on in summer, so I can concentrate on playing live and not on composing.
There you go.
Because otherwise, that would end up in a total creative block.
In a bad place, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, Marco, we are already out of time. I can't believe it, but this has been a very interesting conversation and very inspiring to me. I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule and having this talk.
Thank you for the nice questions. It's really nice to talk to someone who seems to, or who obviously does have a background in understanding what I'm blabbering about. So that's really welcome and appreciated.
Yeah, it's very fun for me. Well, with that, I am going to let you go have the rest of your day. Thank you so much and goodbye.
Thank you. You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Many thanks to Marco for the chat. It was really great to catch up with him. Make sure that if you're interested that you check out HHNOI, that's HHNOI, for the Modularfield recordings or wherever you happen to get your streaming services from. It's always an option too. I want to thank you for continuing to listen. It's really great, all the feedback I've been getting lately. I really do appreciate that. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, make sure you drop me a line at ddg@cycling74.com or darwin.gross@gmail.com. Thanks a lot, and I will catch you next time around. Bye.